Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It is good to be with you all this morning. Make sure to remind your friends that this is starting up, share the video, like, subscribe to the channel, support on Patreon if you can. A couple quick things. So, one, we had a fundraiser last week for the Mathari Social Justice Center in Kenya to provide money to buy food for people's assemblies in Kenya. We hit that goal in like less than 3 days. So we working with Dindi Katanga on that. We're sending the money over. It should be processed actually by now and getting to Kenya. So we'll have more updates on that as they're actually able to do the people's assemblies. But just thanks everybody who donated to that, supported that effort. Another one also that I'm just gonna lift up real quick again is this effort to support Ashanti Alston, who actually, we should say, is relevant to today's discussion. He is, well, Safiya Bukhari, who we'll be talking about today, was his partner for many years. So anyways, I'm going to put a link to that in the chat as well. Folks can support Ashanti as he's getting his home renovated to be elder friendly, which is something that, of course, revolutionaries don't have pensions. So support Ashanti if you can. All right. So having said that, I'm really excited to announce our guest today. I'm really looking forward to this topic. There's a lot that we'll get into. I know that just as Jalessah and I were joking about this a few minutes ago, but Laura Whitehorn actually replied to the tweet about the show and basically said, like, you better not mess up Safiya's legacy with this episode. And she did it in a much more nice way and basically said, I'm sure that you won't, that you will make clear the differences between Safiya Bukhari and Kamala Harris, which of course is the goal. But anyway, no pressure on us today with Laura Whitehorn. For folks who don't know, longtime comrade of Safiya Bukhari, also edited and wrote the foreword to her book, which is over my shoulder right there. So anyways, that was cool to have her interact, even with the, kind of compliment / warning of our work here. So our guest today, Jalessah T. Jackson, is an antidisciplinary cultural worker, political educator, and reproductive justice practitioner based in Atlanta, Georgia. In April 2020, they founded the Decolonial Feminist Collective, a political project utilizing decolonial Black feminist frameworks in political education, mutual aid, and international solidarity building. They have held adjunct appointments at Kennesaw State University, Morehouse College, and CUNY Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy, teaching courses in Black Studies, Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies, and Public Health. As a community-based educator, Jalessah has developed and facilitated numerous workshops, trainings, and educational initiatives that equip individuals with the knowledge and tools to advocate for themselves and their communities, committed to the fullest development of oppressed people's collective power and self-determination. Their work inside the classroom and beyond exemplifies the interrelationship between study and struggle. Absolutely. So, Jalessah, just welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. It's been a long time coming for us to have you on the show, and I'm really grateful to be with you this morning having this conversation.
Yes, thank you, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm really excited to have this conversation. We're talking about some of my favorite things, decolonial feminisms, and people who are in my community know that I'm always yapping about Bukhari. Bukhari said this, Bukhari said that. So I'm excited to join y'all and to be in conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just say, Laura did see the tweet, but like Laura also follows us. Laura was on the podcast a few years ago. One of my favorite people, favorite elders ever. So, um, yeah, absolutely. But she did know. She basically the comment was, I've never thought I would see the two of them in a sentence together. Was basically the way that it came across. So, anyway, we'll talk. Obviously, we're not putting them in in a sentence together in order to liken them to one another. We should say that up front, but to talk about the very different types of uh, a feminist or liberationist, kind of ethic that they, well, Kamala doesn't represent a liberationist ethic at all, but the very different types of feminism or the way that different types of feminism might think with them. So one thing that might be helpful up front would just be talk a little bit about your journey, your own journey to decolonial feminism as a space where you think and organize. What were some of the things that you would say politicized you towards where you are now?
Yeah, I appreciate that question because it has actually been a journey for me. Um, and I think before identifying as any kind of feminist, I was a Black studies student, and it was through becoming a parent during my first year of college and navigating racism, sexism in my daily life that really politicized me towards a Black feminist politics. And I've always been interested in a weaving of various theories to have a better understanding of my own sort of material conditions and the conditions of the people that I love. So I'm thinking about my family, I'm thinking about the people that I'm in community with. So it was as a student that I began thinking and writing about war, meditating on war. So that included the war on drugs, the war on terror, mass incarceration, and the underdevelopment of Black women and their families as a way, at first, just to honor the women in my own family who had sons and partners who were incarcerated. And as a result of their incarceration, had to take on a lot of additional caring labor in their absence. And so I'm thinking about my mom, I'm thinking about my grandma, I'm thinking about my aunties, right? At that time, as a student, I was learning about Walter Rodney and underdevelopment in my Pan-Africanisms class. I was learning about decolonization movements in the Caribbean and Latin America in my Black and Latin American class. Learning about the ethics of care and accountability in my Black feminisms courses, where my professors generously allowed me to bring my toddler to class when I didn't have access to childcare. It was in that space that I learned about Black feminist writers like June Jordan, Toni Cade Bambara, Pat Parker, and others who were Black feminists and anti-imperialists. And they were building transnational relationships with the Global South, women resistors engaged in revolutionary struggle. In about 2019, I went to Brazil on a delegation to attend a transnational decolonial feminist summer school, where I got to learn in community with Black feminists on the ground in Brazil who were struggling against militarized policing, as well as feminicidal violence and violence against women, against trans folks, and against girls. And for those who may not know, Brazil has the second largest Black population in the world, second only to Nigeria. And in 2022, 6,430 people were killed by police officers in Brazil, which averages to about 17.6 people per day, right? And so when we think about the mapping, when I'm thinking about the weaving, I'm thinking about the relationship between the United States and Brazil. And I would later learn about the military relationships between the United States and Brazil, both whom present themselves as a sort of soft power. Anyways, in Brazil, US Black feminisms were both credited for informing decolonial feminisms and decolonial feminist theorizing, and also critiqued for being hegemonic, speaking to some of the more dominant or mainstream articulations of Black feminisms coming out of the global North and the United States in particular. And so one of the critiques was that the theorizations coming out of the global North overdetermined the field, like really determined and directed the conversations that we were having. And so as someone who was thinking about what it looks like to, practice solidarity, the reality of being a quote unquote American citizen, I began to think about what my sort of feminist responsibility was as I returned to the United States. So in 2020, as you mentioned, I started the Decolonial Feminist Collective, excuse me, to create a space for serious political education that existed outside of an academic institution. And since its inception, we've hosted countless study groups, hosted roundtables, teach-ins, for example, on connecting Cop City to the struggle for reproductive justice, zine making workshops, archival workshops. We've created study guides and more. And I think, to speak to how I arrived at decolonial feminisms and its connection to my process of politicization, it was in traveling to the Global South via these delegations to Brazil, and then in 2022 to Cuba with a collective of Black organizers from the South. What struck me about both of those trips was the integration of spirituality and ritual in the lives of organizers. Like, there wasn't a separation between the role of spirituality and the importance of spirituality and one's commitment to being a committed organizer. Ifa in particular, Lukumi, the Lukumi tradition in Brazil, was a practice of all the Marxist-Leninists that we were learning from, right? And so many of them were priests and priestesses, right? And so I'm thinking about, the role of spirituality in my life right now as someone who is deepening their practice in African traditional religions, and also thinking with Sylvia Tamale, who wrote Decolonization and Afrofeminisms, which outlines an agenda for decolonization and decolonial activism. And in her agenda, she includes restoring our spirituality. It also makes me think about the ritual that took place before the Haitian Revolution. And so I'm just in a place now where, in addition to the political education, in addition to a commitment to building solidarity across borders, also thinking about, as we witness genocides around the world, the role that spirituality plays in our lives as something that's really critical. And I think Palestine has been a really important example of a deep faith in spirit, a deep faith in a higher, being, et cetera. And so that's a little bit about my journey and how I've arrived at decolonial feminisms.
Yeah, right on. Thank you for that. Hang on. So I'm just going to mute you real quick because some folks were saying there's like a little bit of an echo when we're both unmuted. So, but I've had, yeah, I mean, I have similar journey around, especially that question of like spirituality and the role within resistance and liberation movements historically, for sure. So let's lay out some distinctions for people before we get into this, because, there's, I mean, even when you say feminism, we had one person reply who was like, or revolutionary women's liberation, I saw in one of the comments, right? And so there is this, this history of feminism, and there's a lot of different forms. You use feminisms usually to talk about different types. And even within what we might think of as a group, whether that's Black feminism or liberal feminism or fascist feminism or whatever, like there's always multiple forms. And so say a little bit about what some of the forms of feminism or feminism that you have found to be pro-imperialist when we're thinking about something like imperial feminism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. And that's something that we've needed to consistently confront as we see our movements and our terms be co-opted to serve empire, right? And yeah, I use the plural form feminisms. And even when I'm talking about Black feminisms, I use the plural forms because we're not all repping the same set, as I like to say, right? And so I appreciate the, question around imperialist feminisms because it kind of dilutes it down, right? Like whether or not you're a Black feminist, imperialist feminisms is about a feminist thought and practice that consciously or unconsciously aligns with or perpetuates the agendas of imperialism and neocolonialism. So this is a type of feminism that often emerges from the West or the global North, the United States in particular, to speak to our context. And and tends to impose Western feminist ideals and values onto non-Western or global South society. So like real paternalistic with it, very much about like quote unquote women's equality, prioritizing our own sort of goals and objectives over the goals and objectives of women of the global South. Sometimes even going as far to justifying or supporting interventions, political, cultural, or military interventions under the guise of liberating women of the global South. It's important to name that imperialist feminisms is an ideology of assimilation and integration into the neoliberal order, right? It reduces women's gender oppression, people's revolutionary aspirations and objectives to an equal share of the privileges granted in a white supremacist society. So it's really about being able to have a seat at the table instead of a real dismantling of our current order and institutions and society, which we know were built atop of slavery and dispossession of land and settler colonialism. I think, you know, there's some key characteristics to imperialist feminisms, which include, as I mentioned, justification for intervention. I'm thinking about, for example, Afghanistan post 9/11. One of the most cited examples of imperialist feminism is the United States allied military intervention into Afghanistan following the September 11th attacks. This invasion was partly justified by the United States government and some Western feminists as well as quote unquote necessary to liberate Afghan women from the Taliban, right? From their oppressive regime. And so this approach used women's rights, quote unquote rights, as a pretext for advancing geopolitical interests of the United States. The Iraq War as well, you know, similar to Afghanistan, US-led invasion of Iraq was framed as a mission bringing freedom and democracy to Iraq. Iraqi women on the ground and face worsening conditions as a result of war and occupation, which often happens under war, right? If we're thinking from a feminist lens and we're asking questions around what always happens under occupation and war. And then to the sort of cultural side of things, I'm thinking about hijab bans in France, for example, and other European countries that prohibit women from wearing hijabs in public spaces, and that being justified as a way to promote gender equality and to protect women, Muslim women from patriarchal oppression. So despite women, you know, Muslim women scholars arguing that these policies are paternalistic and coercive, in fact, imposing sort of Western secular ideals while marginalizing and discriminating against Muslim women who choose to wear hijab as an expression of their faith, as we were just talking about faith and spirituality, and of their cultural identities. I think the final example that I could use is to think about economic sanctions that are imposed on countries like Iran or Cuba. Those are sometimes justified on the grounds that they will pressure, quote unquote, repressive regimes to improve women's rights. However, these sanctions often have severe humanitarian consequences. You know, despite the consequences in Cuba, you know, I've written in the past and connecting our struggles for reproductive justice in the United States that we can actually look to Cuba, which has legal abortion, which has access to healthcare, access to maternal care, some of the lowest maternal mortality rates in the world. But the sort of intention or the picture that the United States paints is that all of this is done with women's interests in mind. And there are, you know, feminists, you know, oftentimes white feminists, but not exclusively white feminists, which is why we use imperialist feminisms, imperialist feminists who are in alignment with these agendas. And so, yeah, that's how I would sort of map out what imperialist feminisms is. I hope that is clear. It makes sense.
It does. Yeah. Thank you. So maybe a way for us also to bring this into, you know, current conversation is to also talk about, you know, the DNC this past week. And, you know, like there's obviously there's a lot of identification with Kamala Harris that is happening on these like strictly kind of identitarian or identity reductionist, to use the term Erica Keynes uses, lines these days as, a woman, as a Black woman, as a South Asian woman. And it's not necessarily just by people who share those identities. Also, I think it's important to say that, like, there's various tropes that white people have absorbed about the idea of, like, Black women are the people who save our democracy on a consistent basis, right? This is something that we see a lot from, I think it kind of goes to like the Stacey Abrams and some of those type of people that have kind of, proliferated this idea. So talk a little bit about like that, about how do you think about some of these things like the DNC last week, or this embrace of these kind of identitarian feminisms, um, from somebody who embraces a decolonial feminist lens?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to, like, what do we mean by decolonial feminisms then? So to begin there, decolonial feminisms is an analytic perspective that aims to understand in a more complex way the relationship derived between race, sex, sexualities, class, and geopolitics in an overlapping form, right? It argues that these are not simple axis of differences, which is something that, intersectionality sort of argues, but rather differentiations produced by the overlapping oppressions that the modern colonial system produces, right? And so I feel that decolonial feminisms is grasping at the root, while intersectionality is only speaking to like some of the symptoms. There are two sort of like primary sources of decolonial feminisms. It's important to name that it comes out of criticisms that were made by Black feminisms, which gave us frameworks like the matrix of domination and analysis of structural, disciplinary, hegemonic, and interpersonal domains of power. Chicanas organizing working class women, the Latin American feminist autonomy movement, indigenous feminists, and materialist feminists, right? So that's one of the sources. And the other would be the proposals that were put forward in decolonial theory, or the Decolonial Project, which has been developed primarily, but not exclusively, by Caribbean and Latin American thinkers, and implies an understanding of like global and local relationships, which requires that we see Eurocentric modernity, global capitalism, and colonialisms as an inseparable trilogy, right? And so, the Decolonial Project gave us coloniality, gave us the coloniality of power, of being, of knowledge. Decolonial feminisms adds the coloniality of gender to that sort of analytic of understanding our world. And it speaks to the afterlives of colonialisms. So we're talking about, all of those things. And so to speak about Kamala Harris, who to my knowledge is not a feminist. However, as you mentioned, identity reductionism is the name of the game in the United States, right? And it's not a new game, which feels important to name. Like, there's a reason why Barack Obama is still loved by so many, despite him being a war criminal. And so moving beyond just like Harris, but talking about Harris, decolonial feminisms is critical of the concept of Western democracy in and of itself, right? Which, I think that's important to name. Like, altogether, we're not buying into the concept of Western democracy, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Like, we don't know her, right? And so it understands Western democracy as a form of domination that's made possible through colonial wars, violent destruction of other forms of government and social organization, literally born of the colonial fact itself, right? So how could Western democracy be what it says it is when it was created on a settler colony and, produced and maintained through the institution of slavery? So in that, there is no lesser evil. It's just evil, right? And, what I find helpful in thinking about the roles of people like Kamala and, not just her, Condoleezza Rice, also thinking about Linda Thomas Greenfield, our UN ambassador our ambassador to the UN. Also thinking about, who else? Keisha Lance Bottoms, Andre Dickens, Muriel Browser, like all of these Black folks who are in positions of leadership that are carrying forward the political project of empire. And so there's a term that Erica Edwards uses, Black imperial agency, that I think is really useful for thinking about thinking beyond identity reductionism and thinking about the sort of function that folks have as it relates to their relationship to the state and their relationship to empire. And so she sort of defines Black imperial agency as the inner life of Black service on behalf of empire building in the era of the high war on terror, right? And so like we're back in this sort of space, maybe perhaps we never left this space of this long war on terror, which Edwards discusses in her book. So yeah, I think about that, and I think to argue that an increase in numbers of insert marginalized identity, women, Black women, queer folks, I also saw people saying like there were no trans people that spoke at the DNC last week, or there were no Palestinians that were allowed to speak last week, right? To argue that an increase of numbers of these, quote unquote marginalized identities in political office equals prosperity for us all is deceitful and an erasure of everyday radical freedom by freedom making or liberatory or revolutionary struggle by folks who perhaps have those identities but operate in ways that are very much antithetical to the maintenance of US empire. Yeah, I think another thing that I'm thinking about as it relates to feminism, yeah, I'll pause there. I'll pause there.
No, that's great. And also like people in the chat are asking some questions too, so I'll star some of those so that we can come back to them later, and it'll probably allow you to like dig into some of those other points. So one of the things that often is on my mind in thinking about like feminism from a colonial context or a context that is under like US imperialism is like this, and we see this Palestine has this on my mind in particular right now, so I'll just name that. But resistance fighters are often men in these instances, and it's not solely, and it depends. And obviously there we can have a broader understanding of resistance that doesn't just require like the physical person holding the gun to be understood as like the sole means of resistance, but also like the social reproduction of those whole efforts. But it is true, right, that a lot of times it is men, right? And there are these critiques, right, that come out of this from feminisms often of the sort of violence that's associated, of course. There's also the discourses of human rights and the way that which also ties into certain types of feminist ethics. Again, we would probably both say imperialist ones, right? But the kind of way that we get these tallies of how many, it's always important to say how many people are women that are killed, how many people are children that are killed, but it's not at all important to talk about how many men are killed. They're just sort of de facto considered combatants. And then even within that understanding, there's not a discussion of like, do they have a legitimate reason to be combatants, right? It's just sort of like they use this language now of the T word, right? And so I'm interested in kind of your perspective as well as like what you see within decolonial feminism of grappling with these sorts of narratives and finding kind of a solid grounding towards a feminist decoloniality or decolonization that retains some feminist ethic to it, but also is like trying to grapple with some of these criticisms.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. And I'm going to start with the sort of where women fit into revolutionary struggle and resistance movements. I think there's a Bolivian organizer, scholar that I appreciate who said something like, decolonizing practices precede like theorizing about decolonization. That's a paraphrase, but I'm thinking about the theorizing of decolonization coming out of actual movements for decolonization, which were armed resistance movements. And so, when I think about decolonial feminism, it's an outgrowth, it's a natural outgrowth of those practices, which is why we see it coming out of the Caribbean and Latin America and from the continent as well. And so it could be helpful a little bit to map women's participation in revolutionary struggle as resistance fighters, which was the case in the Mozambican Revolution, where women participated in revolutionary struggle by taking up arms and played a critical role in winning their people's independence from Portuguese colonial rule. Some of their military activities ranged from the defense of the liberated zones, thus freeing the men for more offensive activities. But in addition to that, many of the women preferred more active combat in the advanced zones and chose to fight alongside men in ambushes and mining operations, etc. And so there's tiers, right? We know that they were also, the women were primarily responsible for the social reproduction work, as you name. A lot of them were participating in the literacy work. So, like in Mozambique and PAIGC and Guinea-Bissau, the literacy campaigns to improve literacy rates in the country were also really important. Both of those places were resisting colonial rule by the Portuguese. And women were involved in both of those struggles, both as armed combatants and also as caregivers, as, health medics, as agriculturalists, right? And so playing multiple roles. And, in these struggles, a lot of them, they name for themselves, like, various internal contradictions relating to traditions being imposed, navigating sexism, what have you. But also took immense pride in active participation in the resistance struggle. I'm thinking about something I read the other day about Winnie Mandela's granddaughter describing how her mother could strip an ensemble an AK-47 in 38 seconds, right? And that was in a text that I was reading about combative mothers and guerrilla warfare in South Africa. And, since the anti-colonial struggles of colonized women were not explicitly labeled as feminists, they haven't been read as linked or relevant to feminist studies. So if you're not a feminist that is interested in decolonization movements, perhaps you will not link it naturally in your brain in that way. But, as Ugandan feminist scholar Sylvia Tamale reminds us, the participation of colonized women in anti-colonialist struggles and anti-racist movements did often lead to political engagement with feminism. I think additionally to the point around women and children, as you mentioned, knowing that there were other roles that were played, I'm thinking about decolonial feminisms being incredibly critical of binarism as a colonial imposition. And so, even before Mario Lugones coined decolonial feminisms, there was already this understanding of coloniality of being, which criticized the human, non-human dichotomy, which was a colonial imposition. And it was that dichotomy that, allowed for and justified treating, non-white people as not people, right? Justified slavery, justified the stealing of land, the stealing of resources, right? And so I think the sort of categorizing non-white people as non-human speaks to what you're describing in the Palestinian context, because Palestinian people are not seen as human beings, right? And even in the imperialist feminist attempts to sort of have an analysis on the women and children, it still does not register in Western minds, in my opinion. Like I don't see even the demand or the demand to focus on the fact that children are being killed, that, seeing parents hold up their children and with their pieces of their body, like hanging off, holding them in bags. Like the Western mind is not registering that as human life or human death, in my opinion, right? And so I agree with the point around men are completely erased from this narrative. And I think it speaks to the priorities of imperialist feminism, which sort of imposes on other communities who is the enemy. And the enemy for them is men. That's not the enemy in other feminist forms. Like even Audre Lorde and June Jordan and Tony, black men were not the enemy to Black women. it's the same as to be said in decolonial feminism. I think also from a cultural perspective, we don't have, these very fine lines around roles, who does what. Like, as we see, as it relates to resistance struggles and, revolutionary struggle, people wear multiple hats. And what I see happening in Palestine, like, children who lose their parents are cared for by other community members, right? Like, there's people in their sphere, men, women, what have you, that pick up the pieces and continue caring for members of people's families when they have lost their entire families. And so what we see is that the imperialist feminist logic doesn't fit. It can't be exported in the way that we like to think about in the United States. And in doing that exporting, we absolutely completely dehumanize non-white men, and we also dehumanize non-white families altogether.
Beautifully said. Yeah, I think I resonated with all of that. And yeah, and I think that dehumanizing aspect is really key. And I think also, like, it also shows the degree, like you said, like, nobody is showing up for, like, Palestinian children or Palestinian women, really. Like, where are the big feminist or massive pushes for around that? You don't see it. um and so you can see that in many ways that also just exposes how this is an instrument, right? Like, it's a means to an end. And when it serves the purposes of empire, they'll use it, and when it doesn't, then they'll just let it go. We see that a lot. So let's move into conversation on Safiya Bukhari. I'm really excited to be able to have a conversation with you about Safiya. It's still Black August, which, like, she, as we'll talk about, is like, I'm not going to talk about this as the first question, but she's one of the most important people, really, in, like, why we have a Black August, when we really think about, like, her contributions. So let's start just first of kind of a little bit about what aspects of her as an organizer, as a resistance fighter herself, as a figure that and a figure that you kind of, what draws you to her, right? And what draws your collective, the Decolonial Feminist Collective, also to Safiya, because I know that you've done stuff on her this month and in the past as well.
Yeah. So I first read The War Before when I was in Cuba, actually, in 2022. So it's really wild to me that I didn't really deeply know Bukhari before then. But I think that tends to be the case with people who kind of kept their head down and focused on their work and weren't, like, in the most visible figures in their movement. When we think about the Black Panther Party, I think a lot of, or the Black Liberation Army, we don't oftentimes have the image of Bukhari in our heads. I think, what really struck me about her story, and thinking about, my process of politicization, and then just thinking about learning about hers, through reading The War Before, learning that she was born in a, middle class, religious family. She was very protected as a child, and was in school studying pre-med, right? Like, she was just living her life, doing the thing that the young people do: go to school, get good grades, go to college, get a job, right? What really struck me was her retelling how she got involved with the Black Panther Party, and how it wasn't the party per se that, like, got her to join. It was her own intimate personal experiences with the police and policing that was the catalyst for her that activated her. And so, just like from the point of an example, right? It doesn't matter what sort of family you were born into. There are ways and a responsibility to tap in and to get involved in revolutionary struggle, no matter how you're situated. And, coming from a middle-class family does not preclude you from that responsibility. That's number one. I think, as someone who has been, organizing around issues of reproductive justice in particular, I've been a member of organizations organizing in the Black radical tradition as well. And that has been trying to make the links about imperialism, trying to educate people about, programs like the 1033 program, trying to build an analysis, a Black internationalist analysis to activate Black people in the United States around what's happening in Haiti, for example, what's happening in Congo, for example, right? And I think in any collective that I've ever been in, and this just speaks to just like what happens in organizations, there are contradictions that arise, and a real difficulty I have found in moving through said contradictions. And what I absolutely love Bukhari for, her 5th chapter in this book is titled Enemies and Friends, and it's about resolving and confronting contradictions. She practices a level of self-reflexivity that I do not see in organizing often, right? I think that she is a standout in that effect. And, she calls it revolutionary criticism and revolutionary self-criticism. Her commitment to combating liberalism, which she says is corrosive to organizations. And in her discussing that, she even talks about how she has fallen victim to practicing liberalism at times, right? And so what we see in Bukhari is this commitment to truth telling and this commitment to modeling what a good organizer does. She says, she talks about the importance of political education and the difference between reading and internalizing, right? Which is why this is not the first time we've read her work, right? I believe in returning to text so that we can really grapple with what's being said. But I think, that's like two of the main things that really stood out for me. Also, I engaged her work at a time where I was leading an organization, a reproductive justice organization, immediately after the fall of Roe. And I was leading an abortion fund. And so we were having conversations around security and thinking about security in the way that Bukhari discusses it, talking about knowing your people, knowing who you're in an organization with, building trust and what trust building looks like, knowing what your comrade will say when you're there, when you're not there, those sort of lessons became really integral to thinking about how we sort of continue to do work that is being increasingly surveilled and criminalized in the United States today. And so while Bukhari wasn't a reproductive justice practitioner, while she wasn't a feminist, there are all of these lessons that I have found really useful. And I've been able to bring those into organizing spaces. Like when I was leading that organization, we read Bukhari at our staff retreat, right? When I was organizing with this collective, we read her at our annual meeting. And so I think those are all things that have really stood out as it relates to her work, her honesty, her commitment to truth telling, and as it relates to combating liberalism. And then, I'll also say her analytic of war, which is, as I said before, I had been thinking about for years the war on drugs, the war on terror, as someone who has a Muslim father, Muslim aunties, thinking about war as not as something as over there, but war as being carried out by the state against Black people in the United States. Is something that is a useful analytic to sort of do some of that weaving, both thinking about, incarceration and prisoners of war in the United States, which is her focal point, but also thinking about the United States playing global cop and what that means for incarceration rates, for people around the globe, right, with the support and assistance from the United States as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there was also a wild story, and I can't pull it up easily because it's in one of the chapters or whatever, but she escaped prison, right, in order to get healthcare.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And I was like, well, here is the RJ link, right? When we're thinking about how we organize our priorities and that, and I know we're going to talk about RJ too, but one of the things that really confuses me a little, I guess I'll say, is that in our movement, we talk about the importance of centering the most marginalized. And we know that when people are incarcerated, do we really have access to human rights as is? Questionable. Once you're incarcerated, though, you are stripped from any sort of demand on your person at all, right? And as practitioners, we know that when women are incarcerated and they are pregnant, that they're shackled to beds before and after they give labor, that they don't get, the benefits of having time to spend with their child, the skin-to-skin contact, which is so critical to a child's development. That their medical needs are oftentimes ignored, sometimes resulting in their premature death, right? So we know that the conditions as it relates to healthcare, reproductive healthcare, but then healthcare more broadly in cages is abysmal. And that these violations on people's bodies are disappeared from our visual registry because they're incarcerated. Yet we do not fully orient to this demographic of people. And in her chapter around political prisoners, she talks about how a priority around political prisoners needs to be a priority for every single movement that claims to be committed to liberation. It's not just during Black August. It's not just if you organize around policing and prisons that this should be a priority issue for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's just an amazing. There's so many amazing stories, and I really agree with what you said too about her. Also, as somebody who's, I feel like she's getting more recognition finally, but for a lot of years not lifted up in the kind of key. And she talks about this a little bit actually, about the focus on leaders within like our memory of the demo, also as a problem within the not the Black Panther Party, in terms of like people focusing on Huey or Eldridge Cleaver or other people who were kind of prominent leaders within the party. Um, and also, I would say one of the things that I love about reading her work too is like when she's talking about political prisoners and prisoners of war, like she knows she knows a little bit about everybody's story, and she also like, and these are people who a lot of them like didn't get support, right? I mean, we still have political prisoners like that, like Kamal Siddiqui or Reverend Joy Powell or others, right? That like most people just don't know who these people are. But Safia always like would make sure to name these and not just focus on. She did do stuff, of course, to like combat um, the planned execution of Mumia Abu Jamal in the 90s and things like that, but also as we're going to get into here in a second, was really central to founding Jericho movement and like getting a really broad, um, you know, political prisoner organizing agenda. But yeah, that piece that you're talking about also around self-criticism and reflexivity, that's something too that I talk with comrades about of, I think it's an unfortunate thing that so many organizations these days have taken a posture that they can't publicly share like successes, failures, what worked, problem that we couldn't, like, because there's sometimes this need to just present yourself in like a positive sort of public facing light all the time. um and one organization I really value that I think does a good job of that is like Oakland Abolition and Solidarity. They'll do like kind of yearly reviews and stuff like that where they'll talk about like, yeah, we had a problem with too much whiteness within our group, and we saw a bunch of our Black and brown comrades like leave the group, and so this is how we're trying to study and change to like improve this within our organization. So I do appreciate when organizations do that. So let's talk about Black August, of course. Talk about, there's I think there's a good argument, and maybe it's not even an argument, like, but she is maybe the most important figure, I think, in the history of developing organization around political prisoners in the context of the U.S. empire. You know, she of course didn't identify with America. She's a citizen of the Republic of New Africa and actually held several offices within the Republic of New Africa at different points. Um, but understood the need for a kind of consolidated national program around political prisoners, which for those of us who have grown up with Jericho or like these things, she along with Jalil Muntakim, of course, and I think Herman Ferguson, maybe one other person developed this, and it was either Herman Ferguson or Herman Bell. I forget which one, but anyways, they developed Jericho, and before that, you would have people who would focus on political prisoners, but it often was kind of focused around like whoever the really big names were. There was like a celebrity culture kind of attached to it. You think about the Free Huey movement, the Free Angela Davis movement, Mumia, obviously in the 90s. And Mumia obviously is still incarcerated, but he was on death row, which was a big push. So anyways, I know this was one of the things that you all went into on a recent study group that you all held. So talk a little bit about, her thought on political prisoners and prisoners of war, and like what you all talked about or thought about within that.
Yeah. As a collective that's like, what are we going to do about imperialism and thinking intentionally about war? I think starting with her naming them as prisoners of war, right? I think that's where we begin. And, what we talked about, in the chapter, she discusses these terms not meaning anything to our larger community. So like the terms like revolution, terms like liberation, terms like political prisoner. She says like, these don't mean anything to our brother and sisters on the block because we have not done the necessary work to make these terms mean anything. And so we, as a collective that's committed to politically educating people, it was really important to sit with her criticisms. And she has, she starts off, even in the book, I'm in the columns like, wow, she dragged the movement, talking about the movement, if we could even call it that, has gotten to a place where we're having demonstrations and rallies and conferences and press conferences, right? And we only bring out the political prisoners as like a show, but we're not acting like we're serious by carrying out a consistent, committed work to the project of freeing them. And so we talked a lot about the role of political education and ensuring that these words do mean something to us and that they mean something to our community. And she spends most of that chapter on the question of political prisoners, talking about that. She also spends some time discussing the fact that we didn't really take a moment to reflect on the impacts of COINTELPRO on the movements and what that has meant for our ability to continue to scale our organizing on behalf of political prisoners. And so she credits that in the destruction of the Black Panther Party as something that really informed our ability to do that. And she also notes, this is something that stood out to me, is that she's like, the political prisoners didn't end up incarcerated like in a vacuum, right? Like they were part of political formations, and they were doing revolutionary work in their communities, and that is why they were criminalized. And to me, I read that as the significance of being part of an organization. We are not very powerful individually, but we need collectives, we need groups, we need to build power amongst our people in order to change any sort of material conditions. And so she links in a really important way the fact that these words don't mean anything to our community, number one, and two, our community needs to see material changes in their daily lives in order to be bought into political struggle, right? She puts those things together. And I'm thinking about that, in the context of where I'm at, where, there are different organizations that are doing work, and, the conditions in my city are pretty dire for so many people. And so, the goal of our political education is not just to sit around and to think about, like, to read the words that Bukhari said, but to think critically about the spaces that we occupy, the collectives and organizations in which we have membership, and how we can bring these priorities to the organizing table that we sit at. How we can bring the priorities of political prisoners, knowing them, and she even has a list of them in one of these chapters, right? And she asks us to organize events for political prisoners, to write them, right? To ask about what their needs are, to help raise funds for their needs. And so there's like very clear, concise sort of approaches that people can take to honor her legacy. You can tell throughout the text that there's like a deep sadness that she writes with, because she feels like her comrades are being left behind, her incarcerated comrades are being forgotten about, and that we're not remembering the sacrifices that they made for their communities, right? Like, these people had families, they had kids to raise. I'm thinking about, my own children. They had responsibilities outside of their own individual lives, but they made tremendous sacrifices for our collective benefit. What is our collective responsibility then to support their struggles, support their needs, and then to also carry on a tradition, a revolutionary organizing tradition that advances, the position that they brought us to. So we discussed that. We also, through the analytic of war being the sort of through line, put Bukhari's sort of assessment of political prisoners in North America in conversation with thinking about political prisoners when we think about transnational analysis. And so we read an article on Palestinian women political prisoners as well. And, to bring it back to the conversation we were previously having around women's participation in liberation struggles, like, that essay is talking about how, Palestinian women had been participating in resistance struggles since before the formation of the PLO, right? Like, there's always been Palestinian women's participation, whether or not their families, their husbands, their brothers, their mothers wanted them to participate or not. And sometimes with really dire consequences as it relates to that participation. And so, we were thinking about incarceration, imprisonment, and the role that globalization plays in exporting violence, exporting the prison, making the prison transnational. And so, yeah, it helped us to think through terms like lockdown and connecting, prisons to other states of confinement. So thinking about immigrant detention centers, thinking about psychiatric hospitals, juvenile halls, refugee camps, Indian boarding schools as well. And then this allowed us to think about the prison itself, but also the people who are caged in it as shaped by global factors, like whether they're incarcerated in the United States or incarcerated abroad, like they're shaped by free trade agreements, neoliberal restructuring, and multinational corporate expansion. And so, we, spent our time with Bukhari to really ground us in our own context. Most of the folks were in the United States. We had some people join from the Global South, and then just did, we always try to do the global link because of our commitment to decolonial feminisms, but it was helpful to put them in conversation in that way through the analytic of war, which Bukhari emphasizes throughout this text.
Right on. Thank you. That sounds great. And also, folks, there's a link of like all the places that you can connect with Decolonial Feminist Collective in the show description too. So make sure to follow them, and they're routinely doing different types of programming that you can tap into and check out. So I encourage people to do that. So I have one more question, and then there's one at the end for you to say a little bit more about Decolonial Feminist Collective in that. But after this question, I'll open up and take some from the audience. So I have some starred, but if other people have some, feel free to drop them in the chat. So I did want to circle back again, because I knew that you had worked within reproductive justice organizations, to think about that in this moment too, because we're still pretty much in the same moment that you were talking about, but I realized that was probably like 2022 when like the midterms and all of that stuff was, going, and there was a whole push for people into the Democratic Party of, we have to respond to Roe being overturned, which has led to nothing so far. But anyways, obviously we live in this time where Republicans are definitely engaged in an open assault to access to abortion, for instance, around the country, just to women's reproductive rights and abilities to have any sort of say over that. And the Democrats, in their part, they hold this issue hostage, is the way I would describe it. They it's a useful issue to the Democrats to organize and promote themselves around, but they don't really ever do anything on a national level. And it's also questionable, like, how much they really could do, because I think with the Supreme Court the way that it is now, pretty much anything that they would try to do through policy channels would likely be thrown out by the Supreme Court, given their stance on this. Um, and then, of course, there is like the fact that so many red states are very sort of secessionist and states' rights oriented around their politics too, and likely just wouldn't listen to national policy around these things. So uh, adding that kind of uh, context, and you probably have a lot more to say about this than I, because I know you've been in these spaces, but I'm interested in, I remember listening to a really good podcast. Shout out to Musa from Groundings. You did an episode with them a couple years ago, and you were talking about this a little bit. But I remember you talking about kind of how prominent policy driven sort of orientations and responses are within the reproductive justice space, and you trying to think about how do we orient ourselves differently towards our community around these questions. And so I would really be interested in hearing you talk about that a little bit, and also knowing, I mean, it's ironic really that like the United States is a country that has this imperial feminism that often uses reproductive access as a thing that like we need to bring to other parts of the world, and like we don't have it here. So anyways.
It's really jokes out here. Yeah, I think I've been thinking about this a lot, of course, because I've seen the calls to support Harris for this very reason, right? If you care about reproductive rights, if you believe that women should be able to make their own decisions for themselves, if you don't want women to bleed out because they need an abortion and they're in a state where they can't access it, which is happening, which is currently happening, which has been happening for years now. So I think it's interesting because Obama ran on codifying Roe, I think both times, right? 2008, like I was still in high school. Y'all, I'm in my 30s now. What's happening? So ran on that both times, immediately deprioritized it as an issue as soon as he took political office. Hillary ran on it, she didn't win. Biden ran on it, did nothing, did not even say the word abortion, couldn't even fathom saying it. And so I really have critiques of my own sort of movement space as it relates to relying on a Democratic president for anything, which has not produced any material changes on the ground for us. And I'm in Georgia, which has a 6-week ban, but we have Alabama right here, which has a full out ban. You got Mississippi next to that, full out ban, right? So we're in a region where you either need to travel to have access to an abortion or you just can't have it. And I think part of the problem is that despite reproductive justice being a framework that was coined in 1994 by Black women who wanted to take an intentional departure from the reproductive rights framework, which is very much about legal protections for care, right? These Black women were saying like legal protections are not enough because we have issues as it relates to access, which is true, right? Like it's not just about whether or not you have the legal right to an abortion. It's also about, can you pay for one? Is there a clinic? Do you have a healthcare clinic that provides one in your town, in your city? There's all of these, can you take time off of work? You know, most workers don't have paid time off. So that's not a reality for many people. And so created a framework with the intention of really prioritizing their community needs. We're talking about Black communities, Indigenous communities, communities of color. However, the misstep was aligning this framework neatly within the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights framework. So they're like, we're taking a departure from civil rights, which is specific. It's state specific. If these are your civil rights in Georgia, these are your civil rights in Maryland, for example. Human rights are inalienable rights. Everyone's entitled to them. And the United Nations will make sure that you have them. So I think the one mistake is creating a framework that fits neatly within these sort of state institutions. So I think as it relates to like what actually needs to happen, what our communities actually need is to remove reproductive justice from a universal human rights framework, which captures the entire framework and movement. Um, and and this hyper focus on one singular issue, the issue of abortion, which is important, right? Um, the framework also says that people should have the right to have a child and raise their children in safe and sustainable communities without the fear or threat of violence from individuals or the state. And I see a direct link between the construction of cop cities in Atlanta and all over the country as a barrier to us being able to access that right as it relates to reproductive justice. And so the expectation is that we deprioritize these other values that we have that are central to the framework, the right to have your child, right? And I think it's imperialist. It's like the imperialist feminist framework bleeds into reproductive justice, where there's this hyper focus on this, but we're not addressing poverty at all, which informs whether or not someone can have access to an abortion, also informs whether or not someone who might want to have a child can actually raise that child with dignity. And so I think it looks like divesting from the mainstream form of reproductive justice as we know it. The entire movement has been captured in the nonprofit space. And so it looks like building mutual aid networks in communities, training abortion doulas that work outside of clinics, outside of abortion funds, that work independently, that can transfer information to people on how to access an abortion, how to self-manage an abortion. It really looks like taking back what we expect from the states and being able to provide some of that within community. And in order to do that, we actually need to build popular support amongst the people, and we don't have that currently. We're just relying on the legislation. In every single legislative session that we have, more and more states put forward bans on abortion. And so, yeah, I think that we have to completely reorient to how we are operating as reproductive justice practitioners. But right now, there is a deep investment in electoralism. There is. And very few people want to do anything other than that at the moment. Like, very few people are doing anything other than that. So, decisions have to be made around like what we put our energy in. And I see, like rogue collectives propping up and doing the work, but it might be, it's been 30 years of the movement. It might be time's up on that. If we can't reorient, if we can't situate RJ within a decolonial feminist lens, which is critical of the state and is not relying on it for access to care, then I don't really see us making the necessary progress to achieve our goals.
That's a great answer. Yeah, there's something else I was going to ask you about it, but maybe I'll think of it in a minute. There's other good questions people have in the chat, so I'll get to some of those. So Janine Jones asks, could you elaborate on the distinction between decolonial feminisms and intersectionality, perhaps providing examples to illustrate the working difference between the two, if possible? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. So decolonial feminisms is really thinking about the colonial matrix of power. This includes legal institutions, right? And so it is critical of the UN, it is critical of law, it recognizes the limitations of law and legality. And whereas intersectionality works very neatly within a legal framework, it is part of critical race theory, which is a legal framework. And that really talks about experiences of oppressions as it relates to identities that a person holds, and those identities intersecting, right? But it doesn't really ask questions around the roots of things like, racism, the roots of the law in our country, the roots of sexism and patriarchy, or even like the creation of gendered categories, right? It doesn't ask some of those deeper questions. And unlike, I mentioned the matrix of domination, which is a framework coined by Patricia Hill Collins, a Black feminist, Patricia Hill Collins. She's discussing, the domains of power, which speaks to some of the roots of what we're discussing in decolonial feminisms. And so I think, there are some decolonial feminists like Ochi Curiel, for example, who critique intersectionality as being about multicultural, like liberalism, that is really about how we integrate into already existing colonial institutions and practices, et cetera, whereas decolonial feminisms is interested in divesting and dismantling those systems altogether. And so that's how I would describe that. And I think a funny thing, maybe it's not that funny, but I saw a picture of Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined intersectionality in 1989 with Mapping the Margins. She posted a picture of her and Kamala on Twitter, like maybe several weeks ago. And I think that is emblematic of the aims and objectives of intersectionality, right? And so we know that decolonial feminisms is critical of Western democracy because it's not the same political project. And you'll see some, decolonial feminist theorists utilize it. Many of them talk about the limitations. And so they might use components of it and also use another framework that fleshes out more of the sort of root causes or primary contradictions.
You anticipated what I was going to ask you next with you just said the phrase primary contradictions, because I think this is a question that I had, but it's also, I think, an interesting thing for us to think about a little bit, and in light of some of the things that like some of our audience is asking. So one person asked, is colonialism the only threat to feminism, right? Which is sort of, I think, one way that we might think about, because obviously no, it's not, right? And then also this was a question to what makes this was from early on when we were talking about imperial feminism distinction. What makes it distinct from most contemporary feminism as broadly practiced? They said, I just call this feminism, distinctions without a difference, right? And so thinking about kind of mainstream, I guess, feminism. And so, yeah, I mean, I think you could kind of respond to those comments, but that would be sort of one of the questions I would have too, is like, for you, probably specifically, is it important to think about contradictions in some sort of order in order to think about how to dismantle them? Or, is it really a politic where you have to address them all simultaneously or put them with kind of equal weight in some way?
That's a good question. I think that decolonial feminisms is interested in pulling at multiple threads at once. And that isn't to say that there is an equalizing of all issues, right? It's interested in understanding how the issues are connected to each other, though. So, for example, if we're talking about imperialism or militarism, like we're thinking about that in relationship with patriarchy, right? As like superstructures. And, underneath that umbrella, we're also talking about violence against women as a result of military occupation, as a result of internal dynamics in one's community. I think the article we read on Palestinian political prisoners does a really good job of sort of like discussing that, where they're discussing like participating in resistance movement, and like their main objective is to get their, end the occupation. And they're also dealing with, traditions that can be, suffocating for them, sexism in their own communities. And so I think it's context specific also, right? Like everybody has a different role to play depending on who you are and where you're at. Like when I went to Cuba, like talking to feminists there, they're like, yeah, like we're still dealing with male chauvinism, like we're still dealing with anti-Blackness. The primary thing that we want y'all to go take back, run and tell that to your government, is to end the US blockade, right? And so like as a US citizen, like that's my role in that sort of larger struggle. And so, I think that we are people that can do more than one thing at once. Like we can do multiple things at once. I personally am not interested in like separating out our issues. And I think that's why I find a home in decolonial feminisms, because it's a feminism that offers an analytic of war and of imperialism and of colonialism, and thinking about how that informs every aspect of our lives, right? Like, we're thinking about colonialism and then what that means for knowledge production and epistemology and epistemic violence. We're thinking about being like, who gets access to being a human, or even like the question around womanhood is very much contested too, right? Like, what makes a woman as it relates to coloniality, for, you know, how, and what does it mean to identify as a woman despite the state not seeing you as one, right? And so they can't really be disconnected. I guess some people focus more heavily on different aspects of it, but they're all inextricably linked. And I think that's the main point that decolonial feminisms is trying to make.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I think so. And I appreciate, though, the Cuba point, because I think it helps people understand, like, a lot of it is like there's the theoretical level, and then there's like what's practical for people in different places in terms of how they're going to engage in the struggle, right? And so it's like within a context where, you know, you're a part of an anti-colonial liberation movement, patriarchy might actually be really important for you to deal with within your movement, both in terms of its own success, but also then what you're fighting for, like what you want afterwards. However, like, you know, me, white US person in solidarity with said liberation movement, is probably not my place to be like browbeating people online about the patriarchy within their movement. It's my place to say, how can I support stopping the bombs that are dropping on them or whatever, right? And so, like, that's another, I think, critical thing for people to differentiate, is it's not that we can't hold all these things together as real, as different forms of, but like also understand what's our place given where we're situated, you know, so that it's not like, doesn't become the thing of like, oh, we have to wait until after liberation or the revolution or whatever to address it. But it does mean that like we might have a different role in terms of like what we're doing, you know. I think Cuba is a good example of that, because like a lot of times people will highlight the internal contradictions within Cuba, which of course there are, right? Just like there are internal contradictions among Palestinians, right? Like any group of people has that, but that doesn't mean that that's our role as within empire to like spend our time there, you know.
Correct. Like, know your position. Like, you literally live in the United States. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So somebody asked to like, what would decolonial feminism offer me that Claudia Jones wouldn't? Triple oppression, which is an anti-imperialist project. I imagine, I'll just say one thing. You can, I'm sure you have thoughts, but part of it too is like, that's one way to look at it. Another is like the Decolonial Feminist Collective is one space where you're looking at and addressing things, and it doesn't mean that like it's the only space that people can. And I imagine you read stuff like that along with other things. So yeah. But anyways, I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. That's exactly how I would answer it. Like, there are a number of different terms that are useful. We read Claudia Jones a couple years ago. Actually, Carol Boyce Davies was one of the facilitators at the Decolonial Black Feminist School in Brazil. And so I find the triple oppression really useful, a useful framework. As I find Patricia Hill Collins' Matrix of Domination, which talks about the domains of power, and the way that she articulates that is really helpful for my understanding. But yeah, I think I mentioned the weaving that I feel like is really important to my political development. And you know, a lot of these decolonial feminists also identify as socialists. Like, these are complementary frameworks. They're not antagonistic to each other. And so I think it's also important to name that. And so I wouldn't choose one or the other. I would take as many as the tools that I can. And, you know, it's cool to see how the different frameworks resonate with different people. And so I'm interested as an educator to think through like what is sitting with people right, and going with that based on like whatever group I'm facilitating, whatever teaching I'm doing. That's how I'm kind of thinking about it. But Yeah, like Bukhari's not a feminist, right? Like,
Right.
but
This was one of the things I knew that somebody would bring up at some point, right? Is it's like it's similar like Bukhari, like Asada Shakur, like sometimes they'll say like we don't identify with that. And I think a lot of times a lot of that has to do with what is the feminism that they're encountering, but also like they're engaged as women in a resistance movement, and it's just not the primary framework that their resistance movement is
right,
collectively operating under. It doesn't mean that they don't have criticisms of patriarchy, right? Like
which
yeah,
they do, which they
yeah,
did, right? Even Bukhari says like the behavior of men in the party was a reflection of the larger society, which that was her way of saying the thing, right? And Asada talks about it too. Bukhari talks about the free love policy that they had in the party, right? And someone trying to discipline her for not giving the free love, right? Like there are all of these things that are at play here. And I also think, it's important to think about the times in which some of these writings were happening and like what sort of antagonisms are happening at that time. Like if I think about what folks like June Jordan and Audre Lorde are writing about was, this real hesitance for people to identify themselves with feminisms because of the forms that they had encountered. And, they're, so I actually don't need them to identify it as that for me to find their work useful. I take what is really useful to me, what I think is useful to the communities that I'm collaborating with and facilitating education with, and that's where I go with. Is it anti-imperialist? Cool. Is it,
yeah.
these are the checkpoints for me.
I mean, I think too. I mean, there's always just also different ways that people can plug in, and yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, part of the reason I wouldn't have you on if I didn't think that your politics were solid,
Right.
regardless of like what names that
Mhm.
people organize under, and I think like Laura Whitehorn, again, to bring her back up into the conversation, like she went through a lot of different phases of her organizing, and I was trying to remember, but I think it was like maybe at Harvard or like MIT or something, but she was involved in organizing, I believe, in Boston. Maybe it was a BU, I don't know.
Mhm.
But it was feminist, I believe, but she was like pushing them to be like super anti-imperialists
Mhm.
during the Vietnam War, right? And so it's like the and had to obviously deal with all of the contradictions and stuff of that space, but did really good work
Yeah.
towards that effort. And I think that's the thing for people too, is it's like organizing, you're going to be in the spaces or the containers or whatever that you are in.
Right.
Obviously, you can choose and you can make a case and you can pick a camp and like all those things, but like wherever it is, it's going to have those different contradictions too that you're going to be grappling with,
Yeah.
and the goal is to like push it towards the most revolutionary kind of direction that you can. And so I
Exactly.
think from my point of view, it's like we need all of these things,
Mhm.
and we can all learn from each other. But yeah, anyways, I do understand those. I think a lot of people's criticisms of feminism come from their criticisms of the most dominant kind of mainstream and imperialist versions of what feminism is, and so they don't have as much exposure to other forms of that.
Yeah, like I remember seeing somebody say like, feminism is not anti-imperialist. And I was like, well, most of it is not, but then you have like books like this, like, like you have, different, there's always like different threads. I think about the Combahee River Collective, who created that container, like that autonomous space, because they were lesbian, socialist, anti-imperialist feminists, right? And also, like, we don't want to just talk to each other. Like, if we're organizing, that means that we have to go outside. And the people in my community, they probably not going to call themselves an anti-imperialist, or like it's my job as an organizer to meet people where they are and to bring them over here. And so, yeah, I'm really interested in thinking across and thinking with and taking what resonates and what works and then leaving the rest.
Right on. Some question here. I think this kind of there's two together. I'll just sort of pull up. What does decoloniality offer that Black feminists don't claim themselves of providing as well? I didn't fully understand this question, but then there's a second one from this person that might help. So what is the epistemology of decolonial feminism that we're supposed to study here? What traditions should we not group it with, especially if people were drawing insight exist outside of it? So maybe a little bit about that, about like what does decoloniality offer? Like, how
Mhm.
does that distinguish it in some ways from, I mean, I think part of the problem with Black feminism is it's so huge. It's a huge camp of thought at this point, that with
Right.
very different people in it. Um, and and so yeah, what are some of the distinctions that you would draw, that you would say, like, when it hits these particular maybe lines of demarcation, it's not decolonial feminism?
Yeah, I think, that's a good question because on its surface, you're like, isn't it all the same? Um, and it's not. I think being clear about what the political project of whatever set of feminisms is really helpful for understanding if it should be in conversation with decolonial feminisms. And it depends on which articulation. So you have liberal Black feminisms, which is very much like concerned with um, assimilation, with multiculturalism, with individualism, and like I'm gonna get mine, and like a lack of real commitment to the larger Black community. Liberal ideals, right? Deep belief in empire, deep belief in the ideals of US democracy is how I would really think about liberal feminisms. And then, if I'm building off of sort of Joy James's radicalizing feminism, she categorizes like neo-radical feminisms, which is feminisms that like uses revolutionary language, but sometimes does not align as it relates to the actual political project of that feminisms. This is what I see most commonly in our day today, where they'll cite all the revolutionaries, they'll like sort of really put on the performance of revolutionary beliefs, but then they'll run an electoral campaign for, then they'll sign on. I don't even know if y'all remember, a couple years ago, there was that Black Women For, and it was like the Black Women For Warren, whatever year that was. I was gagged by that.
I do. Yeah.
I was gagged by
Yeah.
that. Okay.
It relates to a lot to like the conversation that we had with Hiram Rivera last week, and we
Exactly.
had a prior one with him, talking about some of these contradictions that exist within things like the movement for Black Lives, or
Exactly.
just in general, like non-social justice nonprofits, and that are well funded. And so yeah, they'll bring in, they could bring in Frantz Fanon, they could bring in
Yes.
anybody who
Yes.
is a revolutionary figure, and use a quote, use an image.
Yeah.
But then, like, what are they actually asking for us to do is the point where the rubber meets the road a lot of the time.
Exactly. Yeah. And so as you see, it's not limited to Black feminisms, right? Like this cuts across movement spaces. So it's not a unique problem that we're facing. And then you have revolutionary Black feminisms. And those are feminisms that are, working against the state, right? Like working to steal back our power, working to build power with community. This form of Black feminisms has anti-imperial commitments. And so it can be kind of like a matter of terminology. I think for me, the commitment to a decolonial feminisms speaks specifically to my commitment to a feminist solidarity with the global South, and a belief in building towards forms of decolonization through decoloniality, which like allows for decolonization to look like a lot of different things. So it looks like shaking off the colonial filters, but those exist in education, those exist in the law, those exist, I have my one little lane here, I'm an educator and this is what I'm committed to doing. But so yes, I think those are the differences between the types of feminist forms that we see. And so I think the language is important. And I do oftentimes see people flatten feminisms. And I think if like a real ethical engagement with the body of work would provide a lot of clarity for people. Like you can't read June Jordan and like continue to think that Black feminism is useless. I don't know, like maybe you will, but I personally couldn't. I personally couldn't, you know? You can't read
Yeah.
Toni Cambara, who's like, I start with the recognition that we are at war, and like connecting that to the ability to tell the truth about our current conditions and what it means to build towards revolution. So yeah, I think you know, and I did watch the podcast episode that you had previously, and I appreciated a lot of the comments because it is through the way that these organizations misrepresent these figures, these historical figures, these feminists of before, and give bits and pieces of it. Someone in study group said the other night, like, yeah, when people talk about Audre Lorde's The Master's Tools, like they never say the last line, which talks about the project of integration and assimilation. And it's a critique of that, right? But they just say the master's tools will never dismantle master's house, right? And they just end it there. So it's up to us, like as organizers, to be good students and go to the text ourselves to find out what's really there, instead of just believing what folks are saying about whatever various theory online.
Yeah, I think that's important, and it kind of gets they offered a follow-up, and I'll just respond to this because the issue is that the peer that it's frequent that we change the prefixes but don't get to the heart. And so that's, I think, the one point that I would just draw up is like Olufemi Taiwo's work on like elite capture, right? Is that part of the reason that the language does change over time becomes because people will they'll be engaged in a project, right? And then that project experiences so much growth and also liberalization and elite capture that then they actually have to create new language sometimes in order to like say like, no, this is the part of that project that we were a part of, these are the political confines of it that we want to now pull out of that and still work with.
Right.
But we can't actually continue to still organize sometimes under those older banners because they've become so big and we don't anymore have the means to like gatekeep or police what these concepts mean, you know? And I think that's an important thing for people to understand, is that language like that, it you know, I mean, some people will argue that certain terminology is harder to capture than others, and I think that there is some truth to that, but the reality is that, man, I mean, people are really good at taking a radical quote, radical language, and totally evacuating it. And I mean, to use an example, some examples that some of our audience members might be more interested in. I mean, we could talk about how many different variations of what socialism or Marxism mean to people, you know, in different parts of the world, in different parties, among different academics. And it's not all the same thing at all, right? And so it's like, it is important that we, as you said, ethically engage, understand what is being proposed, what is being argued. And yeah, it's just, I think that's just critical, because the reality is that the terms themselves, they're not capable of just defending the politics by themselves, you know.
No, you see what I'm like, even with Black August, what I've seen in more sort of, I've seen nonprofits, you know, posting about Black August, and it's frightening to see what's happening as it relates to what the intention for Black August is, what the commitments to it are supposed to be, and then it becoming more popularized, which is like, you want more people to know about Black August, but not in this way, right? I don't know. So
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's interesting because I remember doing stuff on Black Augusts like a few years ago, and like I felt like almost nobody was doing it or was even like knew what it was or whatever. Now it's like everybody is. And so, yeah. I mean, I think this person raises a good point about, you know, on the ground organizing, you know, and I agree. I mean, I think that where these things become, you know, where they come to light too is like what are our practices associated with these things, you know? And so yeah. Um, so anyways, think we're gonna kind of come to a close. It's been great to talk to you. As we wind down, I would love if you could just talk, you know, say a little bit more about how people can connect with you, your work. I think do you have a new show starting up? I think there was one the other day. Yeah,
Yes.
so say a little bit about that,
Yeah.
and then also where people can connect with the Decolonial Feminist Collective and anything that you have on the horizon.
Word. Actually, yeah, and this speaks to the last question that was just up there. Yes, we have a new show. Myself, Joy James, Khadijah Haynes, and Marsha Myrie, a group of folks coming together to discuss decolonizing feminism and captive maternal agency. So that is a space where we're really trying to confront the capture of Black feminisms and to really make the connections between Black feminisms and the work that's actually happening on the ground. And that is on Black Power Media. So we'll be doing that bi-weekly on Mondays at 9 a.m. Would love for y'all to tap in there. And where else? If you follow Decolonial Feminist Collective on Instagram, we post our regular study groups. Also a place where you're welcome to come ask questions and contribute, critically engage some text. We also, you know, we do some other events as well, like teach-ins and archival workshops and, you know, fun stuff. You know, in the future, I hope to do, you know, to the question around on the ground, I think it's important for decolonial feminisms to continue to participate in these sort of transnational delegations. And so, you know, in the going to Brazil and actually being with Brazilian feminists on the ground who are organizing, going to Cuba and grounding with Cuban organizers, thinking about what that looks like in the future for DFC. So more on that soon, hopefully.
Awesome. Yeah. And again, like all of the link tree for Decolonial Feminist Collective is in the show description. So that'll give you a lot of places to find and follow them. They're on Instagram, on Twitter.
Yep.
I still say Twitter. I'm not gonna ever say X, but
Yeah.
anyways, Jalessah, thank you so much for this discussion. Really appreciate it. Appreciate you responding to so many audience questions as well. And yeah, it's been great to be in conversation.
Yes, thank you for having me, and thank you all for tapping in.